Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good evening, good afternoon. Um, my name is Evan Bissell. Work at the Other and Belonging Institute. And before we get into it, I'm going to give some language justice information so that we can all get plugged in the proper space. So the entire Radical Imagination team, which this initiative comes out of, shares a commitment to language justice, which includes the right we all have to communicate and share our own stories in our own languages. Language justice entails a commitment to creating multilingual spaces where everyone can show up as their whole self and participate fully. Sometimes that looks like everyone participating in the same room and using the tools and practices language justice and interpreting offer so that everyone can be part of the conversation equally. And sometimes, like today, like this afternoon, it looks like a presentation happening primarily in one language, while interpreters work to include folks who use other languages, in this case, ASL and Spanish. So today's workshop is being interpreted into Spanish by Jen Hofer and Shayla Hong from Antenna in Los Angeles, which is a collective dedicated to language justice advocacy and practices. And today we're also joined by Billy Sanders, who is doing ASL interpretation as well. So just a huge thanks and big ups to all of you. Feel free to visit antennalosangeles.org if you'd like to learn more about their work for language justice as well. So thank you all. The links for Spanish are in the YouTube description below. We'll be dropping them into the chat periodically. We will also be working with worksheets for today. And there are links to English language versions and Spanish language versions as well. And those are both in the YouTube chat also. So just so we're all set up in the proper spots. So thank you all again for joining. And we're really excited to get into this. This is the second part of our Research for Radical Imagination series. And today we are focused on questions and listening deeply for transformative questions. So even though we are joining from a virtual space this evening, we're all joining from somewhere, someplace with history and texture and meaning, with people who have been there for continuous habitation for a long time. And so we want to acknowledge that non-native people are occupying stolen land. And here in Berkeley, this is the unceded territory Huichun, which is the traditional lands of the Lisjan or Ohlone people, whose language is Chochenyo. So the Ohlone continue to live here and in other places around the world, and we recognize the Ohlone relationship to their traditional lands and that of all indigenous people to their lands. We recognize that the colonial project that stole these lands and committed genocide is not only in the past tense, but one that is ongoing. We also recognize that resistance to this colonization is not only in the past tense, but is ongoing and strong and rooted in projects here in the Bay Area, like the Segurate Land Trust, which is an indigenous woman-led effort to rematriate land through the transfer of land into a trust, or the development of the Shumi land tax for those of us living on this land as a result of that colonization, as a way to help support the rematriation of that land. So we express gratitude and appreciation for the people whose land we occupy. We stand with efforts for sovereignty and self-determination. And we'll invite you to add in the chat the names of indigenous peoples whose traditional lands and unceded territories you are joining from currently this afternoon or this evening. And we'll drop a link in the chat as well if you'd like to do a little research on that or don't know it. Thank you all. So we'll give a moment just to do that and welcome everyone to join in. Thank you. It seems like people are rolling in. Great. Thank you all. Like there's people calling in from all over. So thank you. I also want to take a moment or some time really to acknowledge that the wealth of this country is built through the violence of anti-Black racism, and that people are rising up in power around the country to challenge this legacy today and yesterday, and until we truly live in an abolition democracy. What little bits of functioning democracy we do have are thanks in large part to the constant and long history of the Black freedom struggle and the courage and the love that is compelling so much action today, yesterday, and tomorrow. is an essential pathway for our collective liberation. So I want to take a moment just to reflect on the legacy of Breonna Taylor and how it may compel us, and in this moment and for the rest of our lives, in defense of Black people and towards collective liberation. So we'll take a few moments now just to reflect on that. Thank you. All right. Thank you. Rest in power, Breonna Taylor. So my name again is Evan Bissell. I'm an artist, a researcher, and an organizer at the Othering and Belonging Institute, where I work as the Arts and Cultural Strategy Coordinator. I use he and him. I've been working at the intersection of art and organizing and research for the past 15 years. A little bit later, I will be joined by Tamisha Walker-Torres, who is the executive director of the Safe Return Project. I will also be joined by Nicole Montojo, my colleague at the Othering and Belonging Institute as well. So this is going to be an active workshop. So I know we're joining here in the YouTube world, but we're really going to be inviting you to take moments of pause throughout to do some reflection, some thinking. Hopefully, what we're doing this for is to move us towards action, and pairing that with reflection. So I'm going to bring your attention to a couple links that are in the YouTube description. These are worksheets that we will be referring to throughout the session today. You can also pause the video if you want. If you want us to go slower, pause it, come back to it. It's being recorded, and so you can kind of go through this at your own pace. We will also be recording this, so you can come back to this as well. So take a look at those links in Spanish and in English. Great. There's also a set of resources in the description below for PAR. So if you're excited about today, these are ways you can get into it a little bit deeper. So why are we doing this is a good question. Why this initiative is bringing together, it's called Radical Imagination for Racial Justice, which is an initiative of the CERDNA, a program of the CERDNA Foundation, and we are working with the Highlander Research and Education Center and Southwest Folklife Alliance to support artists around the country who are working to advance racial justice at the level of systems and structures. So why are we partnering researchers with artists to do this work? I think for me, my background is really as a community-based artist. And I really came to see the work that I was doing as an artist, the stories, the visuals, the rituals, the relationships that came through that process as a process of inquiry. And so as I started to dip into participatory action research, I saw how the formalization of this practice of inquiry could really help strengthen the power of the creative work in multiple sectors. So like Alan, who's the co-director of the Highlander Center, shared last week in that session, which you can access in the YouTube link below as well. We come at this from a view that knowledge and information are forms of power. And a key to thinking about this is whose knowledge is made actionable. And artists have a particular way of advancing racial justice. Of providing radical and nuanced analysis and knowledge that we believe can advance racial justice at systems. And again, how is that knowledge made actionable? So for me and for many others, PAR has been a key way to bridge that. Thank you. I will slow down a little bit to our language justice team. Thank you for the reminders. And so this is the work we are doing, bridging the knowledge generated in artistic practice and organizing and cultural organizing with research to shift power in multiple sectors. So we're starting from a place of deep respect for their insight and inquiry that artists and organizers are constantly engaging, and working to support this in responsive ways and towards longstanding change. So in this workshop, we're specifically focusing on questions. Questions have a unique power to shift our worldview, right? This is why the questions of kids are kind of always causing us to reorient or rethink how we see or perceive reality. And artists are similarly question posers. Questions are also at the heart of PAR. And so we're going to get into this a little bit more deeply as to how the question posing and the question development process can make our work more responsive and powerful to the communities and the people that we care for and that we work with. So we're going to start with a quick activity and just a reflection and this is building off of the workshop from last week, thinking about we have a lot of the tools of analysis already in our lived experience and in our ways of perceiving and engaging the world already, right? PAR is really grounded in reflecting on this existing experience, asking questions about that experience, and then noticing patterns that come out of that. So from these insights, emerge nuanced and powerful ways of understanding larger systems. So the Colombian participatory action researcher, Orlando Paz-Bordas, was having a conversation during some of his work with a fisherman who raised the idea of sentir pensar, or feeling thinking, as a way to describe the types of insights or the types of analysis that were coming up and that they were sharing together in some work that they were doing. And I offer this idea of sentir pensar in this space to think this is partially also what artists are constantly doing. We're bringing forward feeling thinkings that allow us to perceive and analyze systems as a whole on multiple levels simultaneously. So just as a quick reflection, what we want to do is think about your morning routine today. And your morning routine, sometimes it's the same every day. Maybe it's different every day. But we want to ask you to think about what are some questions that you don't usually ask about your regular routine that you could ask right now. So maybe this is about the materials that you use, like where did the rubber come from on my shoes? Maybe it's about where does the water go when I flush my toilet? Maybe it's why is there a place where I can get coffee on the corner of my street? Or why is my kid feeling extra sensitive today? So whatever comes up for you, and just asking questions about the regular routine you're engaged in today. So we'll take 2 minutes. And then if you could just share out some of those questions that come up in the chat so we can see where we're all coming in from. Thank you. So we'll take 2 minutes just to do that. And just a reminder, these are questions about our morning routine. The regular routine that we don't usually get to ask more questions about. One I like is where does the water go, or whatever it is when I flush my toilet in the morning. Great. Thank you all for taking that small moment of reflection. If anyone would like to drop in any questions that came up in reflecting on your morning routine, get the chat moving and we can be in conversation with each other there. That would be great. Thank you. All right. Let's see, what do people have in here? Hello, hello. Okay, so it looks like as people drop in, we can keep dropping them in, but I'm going to keep us pushing along. And yeah, we'll keep moving with it. So, Dwayne, if you could bring up the first slide, we're going to get into a little overview of the workshop, and then yeah, go from there. Thank you. All right. So this is just where we're going today. We'll be, we've done some of the goals. We've done the opening activity. We're going to start to talk with Tamisha, talking about who's at the table and question posing. We'll talk a little bit about how our worldviews shape our questions. We'll do a deeper dive into the Safe Return Project, which is a phenomenal project that has used PAR for a long time. And we'll talk a little bit about the types of questions and kind of the why would we even formalize curiosity to begin with. And as a reminder, the worksheets that we'll be using throughout are below in the YouTube description. So we will go on to the next slide. Thanks, Dwayne. Great. So this is a working definition of participatory action research that comes from the Highlander Research and Education Center. So PAR challenges the belief that only academics or trained professionals can produce accurate information, and instead recognizes information as power and puts that power in the hands of people seeking to overcome problems in their daily lives. PAR is a collective process of investigation, empowerment, and action, meaning this is not something we engage on our own. And there's a reason why we'll get to that later too. And it's also that the people most affected by the problems, sometimes with the help of experts, share information and knowledge, investigate and analyze the issues, and ultimately act together to bring about meaningful long-term solutions. So this is a great definition that Highlander has been working with for many, many years and has led to some beautiful and powerful work across the country, and particularly in the South. And so we'll be working with this kind of as a grounding place today. So we can go to the next slide, Dwayne. Thanks. So key within this, again, and within this framing, is that knowledge and information are forms of power. So this comes from a racial justice lens in the sense of when we ask what knowledge is valued, how is that knowledge generated? And then lastly, which is a key part of participatory action research, is what knowledge is made actionable. Dwayne, I don't know if you can frame this up so we can see the full slide. That would be great. Thank you. Thanks. So within question posing and the development of questions, really thinking of this coming first from a process of listening. So I want to just share two principles that come from groups that do maybe not formalize participatory action research, but use listening very carefully within their work to fight inequality and oppression in different ways. So the first coming from the Zapatistas, which comes from the sixth declaration from the Lakandan jungle, which is what we're going to do is listen to your thoughts. And then secondly, from the Allied Media Network principles, which is just that we begin by listening. Right. So in this deep practice of listening is the opening for really thinking deep about our questions and the questions we pose and how they can be transformative and provide different insight into the systems that we're experiencing, right? Going back to this idea of senti pensar, that the questions that we are able to pose are rooted in what we're able to pick up through our different awarenesses, whether that's listening or other forms of intake in that way, not just listening as through our ears. So We'll go to the next slide. Thanks, Dwayne. Cool. So one example of this practice of listening that I want to share before we get into the reflection questions is a project that I was working on recently, and a lot of the work that I do is focused on housing issues in Richmond, California. And the project that we were working on was a poetry project around the experiences of displacement for people living in Richmond. And one of the co-researchers, Sierra Jave Gordon, we were developing a series of poems about this. And Cece's work was very was focused out of her own experience and kind of thinking about her own family's experience in relationship to this. But in the development of her work, she started doing interviews and working with the interviewees to develop the questions that they would collaboratively use to create interviews across a group of people. And so this process of listening first and kind of co-developing questions in that process opened up a whole new set of questions. And so the scope of the book of poetry really deeply expanded from it not being just about her experience, but also incorporating the questions that were coming from the co-researchers and the collaborators that she was working with. So what we're going to do right now is just ground a little bit in the issue that you are impacted by or working on currently, and then your goal in doing this work. And we're going to use that as we move through the rest of the workshop today. So like I shared, most of the work that I'm doing right now is around housing in Richmond and displacement and development activities. And our goal in that work is to create community-controlled development processes and opportunities for action to prevent displacement of low-income people of color in Richmond, California. So we'll take a minute now. If you could just jot down what is the issue that you are impacted by or working on currently, and what is your goal in doing this work. If when you get that, if you don't mind dropping that in the chat, that would be great. That way we can see what we're all working on and how we're doing that work together. All right, so thank you all, and feel free to drop those in the chat. I'm starting to now see in the chat just some of the great questions that were coming up from this morning. You know, why did it take me so long to see the thresholds in my routines? Why do I always want to sleep more? Who else is having breakfast and who is not having breakfast or cannot have breakfast in my neighborhood? So these are great questions. I apologize. There's a little lag on my end, but I'm getting these comments in here in the chat now, which is great. So if folks could drop in issues and goals that you're focused on, and we'll continue to build off these for the rest of the time. So, all right. So great. Now I get the pleasure to introduce the amazing Tamisha Walker Torres, who's going to be joining us. And Tamisha is, how do I say, one of the most incredible organizers that, you know, and really researchers that I know. Tamisha is a founding member and the executive director of the Safe Return Project. She's also running for office currently. But, you know, we're not going to talk about that right now. No, we can't. But Safe Return Project has been responsible for some amazing work in the decade that they've been around. They passed the most progressive ban the box legislation in the state when it came out. They created the first fair chance housing ordinance, which is essentially ban the box for public housing and affordable housing. They were a key player in fighting down a jail expansion in Contra Costa County, not one time, but 2 times. So, you know, big ups to them as well on that. They've also been really central in unseating a reactive and longstanding district attorney who it was time for that person to move on in their professional career. And they've just generally transformed the narrative around formerly incarcerated people in Richmond and created dignity and space around this work and around this issue. So thank you, Tamisha. And yeah, how are you today?
Thank you for having me, Evan. It's always a pleasure to do work with you and other unbelonging. I'm doing well. I was thinking about the question you asked about what were you thinking this morning, and I was wondering, why do I prefer ice water over lukewarm water? Which is probably a weird question to try to analyze for myself. Um, but yeah, today it's somber because Black people and people in dark bodies continue to suffer, and so I'm always trying to be conscious of how, in a lot of ways, how I'm blessed, and in a lot of ways, how it's a burden, having to always fight for liberation, and so just trying to hold up.
Thank you, Tamisha. Well, so we're going to get into it in a second. And at this moment, we're talking a little bit about framing questions within participatory action research and why a collective process is so key here. And so, like for myself, when I first started creating art, kind of community-based art projects, the question was often coming from me as an artist researcher, right? And then I was kind of setting the table and bringing people to that table to participate with me in answering that question. But that's not what PAR is. And I think it misses some of the power of what PAR is as well, right? Because the questions that we ask really set the direction of the research and what kinds of things we're going to answer. And so I bring up these images here because for me, this is a great visual metaphor for like the question of how do the questions we ask, how do the different perspectives we bring to this work combine at different points to create a new body or a new visible presence, right? And so this is a sculpture by the artist Antony Gormley. But what I think of it sometimes is like, if in a participatory research process, each one of us is one of these little sticks, somewhere those sticks are overlapping, right? And they're starting to create that form in the middle that we're then able to create a more complex and nuanced understanding of this. And so, that's what I love this visual for that, because it reminds me of this process within PAR of kind of having to constantly ask, who is at the table when we do the question setting stage of this work, right? Which is potentially one of the most important pieces of this work in general. So, within your work, Tamisha, who was at the table for the process, and how did you get them involved in that research component, and why were they the ones at the table?
So, I mean, as a co-founder of Safe Return and now the executive director, in my experience, the first person that had to be at the table was me, as a directly impacted individual, impacted by incarceration and criminalization. And so, because that's been my total experience around PAR, I think what we do in Safe Return is we are very intentional about making sure that communities closest to the pain of the issue that we are trying to address are first at the table. And then we kind of go outward from there. So family, friends, community, but the center are really folks most impacted, and that is for me. That's first, or else the research doesn't move forward with Safe Return.
Great. And as you started to do that and kind of work out from that place, like, how did bringing in those different viewpoints at the table, how did it, how did it strengthen the research for you or the process? I mean, you were saying you start from the self, but you brought more people in, right? And so how did that kind of expand the question posing and what you're doing there?
Yeah, I think we had our firsthand experience with reentry and a lack of resources and being able to re-enfranchise back into society. And so what I think was that the first questions came from us. And the first questions are always like, why and how, those kind of questions. And then we were able to look at, well, what is strategic questioning, and able to review, open-ended questioning versus like, multi-answer questions. And just, it was very heady originally, but then the questions started coming to us about, how do we feel about things? What would we like to see available? What would life have been like for us had what we were imagining in our own mind had it been available? And then we branched out from us, and it's like, well, how are others feeling? Like, what are the questions we need to be asking others around, like, in their imagination, what needs to be available, or how they could have been successful, or what are they struggling with right now? And so it was a very lengthy process. I think we went through maybe 5 examples of our questionnaire, and then we ended with like 100 and some odd questions. And it was really based on what we were currently experiencing, the questions we were asking ourselves, but also questions we felt like we would want somebody to ask us if we weren't already involved in the process. And then it was just amazing to get out there and survey other directly impacted people and find that that it was that they even felt like they wish they had been asked those questions a long time ago, because the system might look different.
Yeah. I mean, the power in being able to choose the questions that you're being asked in that way, and where that goes. I mean, one of the things that I think about in the work that we're doing and the work that we did together around housing, particularly, we had kind of, we had known that the project was generally around housing, but we started posing the question of like, what are the housing and displacement issues that come up for you? And I remember in our first session, it wasn't about like not enough units, or it wasn't about the rent. It wasn't about any of that. It was about education for their kids, and it was about violence, and it was about things like social media, actually. And so for me, like thinking about that, who was setting that research agenda within our group, it was really powerful, because it totally blew out the understanding, the frame of analysis of like, okay, we're going to talk about housing. And none of the questions we originally came up with were really about housing. They were about home, and they were about place, And so it shifted this whole frame. And again, kind of going back to that senti pensar thing, it's like, so often we want to like just be up here, and it's kind of, it's like, yeah, we are multiple things all at once, all the time. And how does the research process account for that? Yeah, I don't know if you have any other
Yeah,
I
mean, one of the things that, just being a part of the Stay in Power process, like one of the things that came up that you didn't mention was people not wanting to be pushed out of what they consider home. And the other thing that came up was like the fear of having to leave, but then the devastation of how many people have already gone. And so there was like a story around like healing and reconciliation that hadn't happened, because families are now like separated. And then the stories of just like what it meant to be in community started to creep up as well in that process, around knowing somebody's grandmama's uncle's cousin, brother, everybody being family, like that rose to the top as well. And I think that's where you start to get to the core issues around place. And for our researchers, say for Churn, one of the issues that came up, and we didn't really dive deep into it, was this idea of wanting to be a part of community or feel accepted or valued, as if we had something to offer if given a chance. And those were intentional questions that we wanted to put in the survey. And I think it was out of our own curiosity of wanting to know if other people felt, cast out like we did. And
Yeah.
it turned out folks did want to give back, but felt like they were being restricted from doing so.
Yeah. 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 It makes me think about, just, I mean, thinking about these worldviews, right? And how, both our experiences, but also what we believe reality or our experience, or, what do we believe to be true, shape the questions that we're willing to ask. And I always think about this question that,
we could ask a question to get the exact result we want. And sometimes that happens in research. But during this process, it's almost always you ask a question and the answer you thought you were going to get, you don't get.
yeah.
But it's the best answer you would have gotten if you, it's like, oh, well, that's better than what I thought I was going to get.
Yeah. 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 No, I think about a question that DeAndre from Rise asked about, how many of us are not statistics? And just this, and he was talking about housing and just, also the storytelling power within that question too. So, we're going to take a moment just for a reflection for you all joining us online, and just to jot down some thinking around who are the people most directly impacted by the issue that you identified, and how are directly impacted people leading the question setting that will guide that work. So we'll take about a minute just to do that, and then we'll come back to just kind of moving on. And you can always come back and redo this, pause us and come back. Yeah. The question that we should be asking ourselves over and over again throughout the process, and thinking about also maybe who doesn't need to be at the table, which we didn't talk about, Tamisha, but I think that's another kind of question as well, right, as we think about this. So one of the things with questions is that they also reveal our worldviews. Our experiences are subjective. And I think one of the things that's beautiful about PAR is that it brings our subjective experiences into conversation with each other. And through that, we create, different understandings of the same thing, right? And so in doing this, we can actually destabilize, or, and I guess I should, in my experience, I feel like I'm constantly learning through the PAR process, because it's destabilizing the things that, my own worldview or what I might have grown up with. And so creating that space of reflexivity is really important within a PAR process. And I'm curious, Tamisha, if you have any thoughts on like times where your worldview has been shifted, or if you've seen the worldview of people that you work with shifted through engaging in a PAR process.
Yeah, I think in our work, it's almost as if more than 90% of what we do is narrative shifting. And it's really about challenging and tackling those dominant narratives that suggest that, for instance, nothing good can come out of Richmond. Nothing, right? People who commit crime, any incident or offense, they're unworthy. There's no redemption. They once a criminal, always a criminal. The just these dominant narratives that really hurt and harm our community's ability to be able to rebuild post incarceration. And that's the huge challenges, like using the par research and the story part to help change hearts and minds is what we've been invested in. And I think because we have to tear down those dominant narratives because they create meta narratives that then play out in our communities, in our culture, and in politics, and even in policy, especially public health policy. And so that's kind of what I think about when I think about what are the stories that are being told, and how do we retell those stories in an effort to re-suggest a new narrative around who people are who are impacted by criminalization. And that's been us. And I think for myself, I think my worldview has changed such that everything is possible, that all things can be transformed, that everything is fluid, as long as we have like an idea of who, like this, I hear like the circle of human concern. It's like if we expand that, and how do we think more deeply about that?
Mm. Yeah. 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 No, there's so many levels that it's working on simultaneously. I think for me, it's kind of the constant reflection of what I'm attached to. Finding out like what's the thing in the system that I thought I was like not invested in, and then somebody will pose a question, and I'll think like, oh, So for one example, one of the Staying Power fellows, had asked this question, like, why do we even have to pay credit reports or application fees multiple times a session, or not a session, multiple times when I'm applying for housing? And like, it's not that I believe that that's a thing that needs to happen, right? But I think that there's a way that sometimes, like, like these questions, they crack open, like, oh yeah, like that wasn't even a space. Whereas somebody who's working in housing justice or thinking about that, like that wasn't even a space where we were thinking about a policy development question, right? And so I think there's constantly that process of reinterrogating my own kind of attachment to systems. And I think, I see that for many people. It's not just, not just me. Yeah, I don't know if you have
a stably housed person wouldn't think about that.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
That's why.
Yeah.
That's why it's a part of the process to center the work in those who are currently closest to the pain of the issue we want to address.
Yeah. 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 And there's so many levels of the big lie that we buy into on different levels. Right. And I think that's some of the beauty of this work. So I think we want to, move into these reflection questions briefly. But it's hard to be reflective on our worldviews and our assumptions, right? Because we don't know what we believe we know, or it's hard to get space from that. So these are some of the questions that we use to help get some of that space to reflect on some of this. So the first one is, how has your thinking changed over time about this issue? So I can remember in relationship to organizing around the prison industrial complex, I can remember the first time I saw Angela Davis speak in 2004, and some of the questions she was posing around abolition. And so thinking about how that change happened then and what can happen, moving forward from there. Another question around what's the big lie about this issue, and how have I bought into it, right? What is the big lie, and not just what is that big lie, but how have I bought into it? I think that's the trickier part, as we get into this, and that's what we get, through the collective process helps open that up. And then what's something people get wrong about your experience or your community? So again, we're not giving you enough time to fully dig into these, but we'll just give you another minute to kind of get into it, and reflect on this. And feel free to add in the chat. There's some great stuff coming through the chat. So I encourage people to go through that. I can barely keep up with it, so I'm not going to try. But yeah, we'll take a moment to respond to, write down on these. Thank you. Cool. All right, Dwayne, if you could bring us back, that'd be great. And so we're actually going to bring Nicole Montojo in to join us. And Nicole, thank you, Nicole. So Nicole's been monitoring the chat and the questions. And if you have anything, that's popping up for you that you want to share out from the group.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for dropping in your ideas and questions. And feel free to keep dropping them in as we go along. And I will do my best to keep track of them. And there's a little bit of a delay, but we'll do our best. So one question from Bob Leonard is, how do you enter into the conversation, especially if you're living in the grip of male white supremacy in a 150-year-old Southern institution, as we're seeking ways to transform the day-to-day practices that are so burdened by habits and assumptions of the institution's historic roots? How do you think about entering into that conversation, especially if you're positioned differently than those who are closest to the issue?
Do you want to go first, Tamisha, or do you want me to?
I will let you take it.
Cool. I think it goes back to, in part, the last thing we were saying about, what is our investment in these institutions to continue in the way that they are right now. And I think that there's a lot of deep work that needs to be done to really dig out, our engagement and our investment in these systems as white men, or as people who identify as white men. And I think that's a key learning place to start from. And I think the question that I frequently get asked, or, that gets asked in all the work I do, is like, why are you here? Like, why are you showing up to do this work in partnership with my, with me, or with my experience in my community, right? And I think we all have different answers for that question. And it's a vulnerable answer, but I think we need to be able to answer it in very personal ways. And so I think that, I think for me, it's a lot of that is reflecting on, growing up in a mixed income neighborhood and realizing the different paths that some of my closest friends took, and the ways that, kind of racism was built into the pushing of us apart. And so having, just thinking around that, it's related to issues around patriarchy and gender and my parents' own relationships. And, we can go into it for a while, but I think, for yourself, whatever that question is, Bob, why are you showing up to do this work, and being able to answer that fully. And then patience and really flexibility in the work. What does it mean to truly be in relationship, and to be in relationship in a way where we're not asking for anything as a transaction, and being willing to share also the outcomes and the distribution of resources, and being willing to advocate for solid distribution of those material things when you're in the position, or if you do find yourself in the position to do that. So those would be some things I would share now.
Thanks, Evan.
I think what I would say is, when you show up, are you do you show up as the expert who knows everything because you're in an institution, or do you show up as somebody who's there to learn? Because we already know you're the quote unquote expert, right? Because we don't have the expertise. But what are you willing to learn in the process? And I think that's always, that's my orientation. Not somebody who's a super expert at research, but we've done a really bang up job at addressing the issues in our community, but always knowing that I don't know as much as I think I do once I get in a room with people who are closest to the pain, and my job is to learn.
Great. I appreciate that. Not a question, but a comment from Sammy Jo Johnson. Trying to figure out who is most directly impacted by an issue and acknowledging indirect impact or harm is a tough and generative prompt. So thank you for sharing. No other questions right now, but if you want to comment on that comment, please feel free.
Could you say that it was could you say it again, Nicole? Sorry.
Yeah. Trying to figure out who is most directly impacted by an issue about acknowledging indirect impact or harm is a tough and generative prompt.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of what I hear, is it's not necessarily about creating a hierarchy of impact. I think it's, there's ways that people are impacted by things in different ways, but it's also about not being humble and real in what that impact is, and so not trying to step into a space that is being held by people who do have a direct impact with something. And so I'm not sure. Yeah, I don't know. Tamisha, do you have other thoughts on that one? Uh-oh. Tamisha, are you still there? Okay, well, it seems like Tamisha unfortunately we'll hopefully have to call back in. Okay. Great. So Tamisha is going to join back in, but we'll move into our next phase. So thank you all for the comments and the questions, and seeing some of the goals and the issues that are coming up as well. And there's some powerful work that people are doing. So this next section, we want to talk a little bit about the types of questions, and this idea of why would we even formalize curiosity in the first place. And then we'll come back to Tamisha when we're able to get her back online. So there's this classic quote that I was reminded of last week, that Selena, who will be presenting next week for Southwest Folklife Alliance, dropped in the chat last time about, when we were asking what is research. Research is curiosity formalized, which is coming from Zora Neale Hurston, is a great quote in that, she was an artist, was a researcher, and really had a deep practice in both. And I think the question for me within that is, especially as an artist, and coming to this from a background in art, is why would we formalize curiosity? Why not just leave it in that artistic space and allow curiosity to be what it is? And so we wanted to try to kind of run through a few different types of questions and what the purpose of this might be. So Dwayne, if we could go to the next slide, and I'll be able to share a little bit about this. Oh, actually, let me see. Sorry, can we go back one? I apologize. Great, we'll stay here for a second. So there's a couple of different reasons, right, just as a broad level. So one is that there are different audiences who require answering different questions and sharing different types of analysis. So like Tamisha shared, there were questions that her and her team wanted to ask because they were the questions that they wanted to be asked about this issue. There are also times where there are strategic questions that get developed, and thinking about how the different types of data that come through those questions that you're asking are able to leverage different types of power. So one example I think about is a partnership between the housing rights organization Causa Justa and the Alameda Public Health Department, who work together to reframe the debate around housing in Oakland in a public health realm so that they could advocate in a specific way that was coming through that. But I think it's important to balance this kind of strategic thinking around questions with the spontaneity and the idea of the emergence of questions, because they can really crack open an issue or analysis in remarkable ways that may not actually be strategic. Sometimes a question just needs to be asked. So one of the questions I'm thinking about, I worked with a project called the Morris Justice Project in the South Bronx for a number of years, 2 years. And that project, as a participatory action research project, really started because a group of mothers, this was at the height of stop and frisk in New York, they were asking, why do the police keep stopping my kids on the way home from the subway station? And so this was not a strategic question. It was not a question that they were going to necessarily formalize to go, advocate or organize. The question could have been, what are my kids doing to get stopped, right? But that was not the question that they were asking from their worldview and their understanding of policing in that neighborhood, or really policing anywhere. So this balance of this idea of questions as strategic, but also questions as just needing to be asked and emergent, and allowing us to break open how we see things and how we analyze structures and systems. And then it's also really important in our work to caution against the urge to reinforce dominant narratives through the questions that we ask. So I think the most frequent example that I see of this is kind of the cost benefit analysis question, for example, around reentry, or we should decarcerate because it's cheaper for taxpayers. And so these kinds of questions, which would then be a budget analysis in relationship to all of those things, they reinforce a narrative around the normalization of prisons and policing in different ways, right? Rather than disrupting that narrative, like Tamisha was talking about earlier. So again, just some general framing on questions, and we'll get into some of these types of questions in a moment. But I want to back up, and Tamisha, I see you're back on, so welcome back. And I just wanted to ask. I like your new background. Just wanted to ask, Safe Return Project has done so much amazing work, and just thinking about the different types of questions that you all asked, and kind of, what were the questions that that you had to ask to get certain types of research answered, in doing what you do, and why you asked these questions in the way you did.
Yeah, I think, so we're going through a research process right now where we're trying to address trauma that women, young girls, and non-binary folks experience before they reach a carcerous type of institution. And so we have a section on trauma. And the challenge was around a substance dependency section where questions like, how often do you use, right? So we were taking questions that a doctor would ask and saying like, well, what are the natural questions that a recovery specialist might ask around substance use? And so we pulled those up and then we put them in the survey. But as we went through them ourselves with some of our women, it didn't feel right. It felt intrusive. It felt dry. The questions just didn't feel right. And so what we actually did was one person said, well, why don't we not ask when was the last time they used? Why don't we ask why they use? If they use, just, not making clear assumptions that somebody is using or not using, but invite them into a conversation. And I think that's been my whole experience with PAR and working with Safe Return, is that we always have to reflect on the question because of the sensitivity around the issues that we're addressing, and our community having to have that trust. The language has to fit.
When we were talking the other day too, and I think maybe this is some of that coming up in some of this, is just the challenge of this and the rigor to rethink those questions in ways that are able to develop that trust, but also be respectful. The willingness to iterate and say, and have somebody say, that question is not cool, and then reworking your questions or whatever it is. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about just that the challenge of the rigor of developing questions through a PAR process. And
it's not easy. So one of the challenges that we face is, so I wouldn't consider myself an expert. But what I do know is that it's a rigorous process. Products don't happen overnight. And we're challenging different capacities that folks have to draw on that they maybe haven't had to draw on in a long time or haven't had to draw on at all. We are asking issues that are at the core of what people are currently struggling with. So like when you're in, how they say, when you're in something, you can't see it until you step back from it. So really just asking people to use tools that they may not have used in a long time or haven't developed to be able to use around critical thinking, around analysis, around deep thinking around your own situation, and then coming up with a solution, and then creating a whole survey, and then having to think through how do we disseminate this survey? Who do we talk to? Who is our target audience? What story do we want to tell? What do we want to accomplish? And I have seen people break down and just pull back because they need a break, because it's so much. And what we're trying to do is figure out, how do we get people through the rigor, but also just acknowledge the space that people are in as people who are actively like the people closest to the pain. And so I think that's something that I'm always very conscious of, is that we're asking people to stretch and to stretch beyond their current circumstances. And it's not easy.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me, from even stepping back a little bit, and maybe this is going too far out, but like thinking about where PAR, or Participatory Action Research, even sits within the resourcing for these types of projects, right? I'm thinking about this in relationship to what you're saying, and in terms of giving people and providing the infrastructure for people to really have the space to engage in this work. Because sometimes, it's like, yeah, you ask a question and it opens up all sorts of things. And, what does it mean to provide the space within a research process where, you can process what it means to have even asked a question that may not have been wanting to be asked for a long time, right? But it's still a question that's powerful and can be transformative of systems. And so part of that is about also, I think, like, kind of traditional forms of research, they put a lot of those resources into the multiple tests and the experts and the various different levels of this. And so how even within a PAR research process, ideally we're thinking about supporting people to an extent where they have some space to have some time to engage these issues in real ways, which is, ongoing organizing also on our part to move those resources into these types of projects, so that people can have some of that also, which is it's a slightly different angle than what you're saying around this, but I think it's part of it also structurally, right? So,
yeah, I think like there are a lot of start stops, and then there's a lot that you don't even use, right? There's like one of the things I found out quickly about research is there's a lot we're not going to use. Like most of what we gather, although it might give us insight or aha moments, we might not even use it. And but we don't want to throw it away. The other thing is just to convince people that this report, right, like this piece of paper with this data telling this story is going to create some social and political change is also a part of that. Like, we don't want to dismiss that. There are a lot of questions around what is all of this going to result in? What is the impact we want to see?
Yeah. I'm wondering, just because we have a lot of artists on the call, if you could share, thinking about, so Staying Power was a project that Tamisha and I got to collaborate on, that was really focused on kind of turning some of the research into artistic outcomes, or thinking about not even turning them into, but using kind of creative and artistic practices to do some of that research. And just thinking, we're like questions that came out through that creative process for you, in terms of, us, designing the mural or going through that process, or even having the mural out there. Just thinking about the relationship between like the artistic practice and then the question posing and the research. Wondering if you have any reflections on that generally, because we do have artists on this call.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciated the process. It made the research and the stories come to life, if that makes sense. The poetry, the the spoken word, the art, even the mural process. It was community coming out, bringing our families to like on Saturdays to, add to this mural that's really a piece of, of research, but now is hopefully a part of a long history of Richmond, right? That people will continue to be able to like see and visualize and learn from years from now. And I think it made it real. It was more, it made it more than a report. And I think that was valuable in the process. So for me, I think we should be figuring out more avenues, more ways to be able to come together and do this work where we can combine, because to me, it's all social justice work.
Yeah.
It's, it's just that we have different ways of seeking justice, but once we come together, we can do greater things. And I think that's why folks were so excited about that mural.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that, like, for me, as somebody who's, as an artist, but also like researcher, who like, like thinking about the ways so often those collaborative processes that come through art are also very similar to a par process, right? And just the whole from beginning to end, really, in a lot of ways. Nicole, I think maybe to bring you on, if you have any questions, we could bring Nicole back on and just see if there's any questions from folks. Hopefully it doesn't bounce you out again, Tamisha.
We've got one question from Selena Morales, and this is for Tamisha. What are some strategies you've used for getting through the rigor and meeting people where they are at? And she says, I think balancing urgent timelines and support for people's wellness is a challenge.
It is a challenge. It's the biggest challenge. I think what I've been able to do is hone in on when I'm overwhelmed. So if I'm, quote unquote, the most experienced person in the room and I'm overwhelmed, then my folks must be overwhelmed, right? The other way that I try to be flexible around the rigor and amount of time that it takes to invest in this is that we also throw stuff out. I'm fine with that. Like in regular research studies, that might be a no-no for us. We might just say, can we do this? Or like, do we need to go back to the beginning? And I'm fine with that. Because if our folks burn out, get discouraged, don't feel like they're building capacity to achieve this task that they really are invested in it, who they are, their current situation. But then when they start to feel like it's too much, then sometimes we have to pull back. And I'm okay. I'd rather pull back and start over than steamroll forward and dismiss any trauma or triggers that might be coming up for folks around capacity.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. We don't have any other questions at this point, but I'll remind folks we're still gathering them. And if you're on one of the Spanish language channels, we're also taking those questions and can share those out with our panelists too. So one comment, Cheryl Fabio says, the ASL translator is so conversational as work, so it's really nice watching you. All right, we can continue on.
Thank you, Billy. Thanks, Nicole. Right on. Yeah, I think, I think one of the things I think about Tamisha is like the idea of like good in the beginning, good in the middle, good in the end, and at each stage in that process, we should be solid and feel like we have full integrity within that, which I think is not a lot of times how traditional research happens, where it's like, you get to the outline and you're done, or you get to the outcome and that's the, whatever you had to steamroll to get there. But I think, if we only start, but if the start was good, then it was good. And we made some change and we made that, we made that work. And then we build on that because we know that this is about a long struggle. It's not about a 6-month project or a 2-year research project. So it's much longer than that, right? I mean, you're a decade plus into this work with Safe Return and, yeah. So,
I wish funders understood that.
Did you want to say that again?
I wish funders understood that that sometimes you might not get a report out in a year. You might not even get it out in 2 years, depending on, what's going on in the community with the population of folks that you're trying to center in the work and the climate, social climate. And you might not be able to produce that report in 2 years. And then the real question, is it the report the report that you're trying to produce, or is it capacity that you're trying to build? And that's two different things. Mm-hmm. And that's two different orientations to the work. And sometimes back to this question around rigor is we do feel, stressed and struggle a lot bumping up against grant deliverables and timelines. And so sometimes it's just, for us, it's like, well, can we get the investment in the capacity? And as a result, we can produce a report that then will lead to social change. And I think that's some of the ways that we just need to challenge philanthropy in this moment, not just in like the par world around social justice or criminalization, but even in the creative world as well, and how that's also exploited philanthropically as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think of it's like deep within the PAR process in terms of like what knowledge or what information is valued, and like having to meet some of those deliverables or outcomes. It's like it doesn't get value until it hits a certain task, right? And I think that's a real shift to say like, actually, no, we just value it because it's there and we know that it's having traction and weight in the community where you're doing that work, Tamisha, or it's happening in those relationships that you're building or the capacity that you're building. And that's really a core goal within this work, really, right? So thank you for that. So I want to shift just to talking a little bit about different types of research questions. This will be kind of our last little bit. We'll do another reflection and some more Q&A. But Dwayne, if you could pop up those slides, bring those slides back up, that would be great. Cool. So again, going back to the types of questions, we offer this not as like a comprehensive matrix or map of all the types of questions that can happen, but really to prompt thinking about what our questions can do. And through that, thinking about how you might ask 6 questions about the exact same pen that's sitting on your table, right? Or you might ask 6 questions about your morning routine. And each one of those questions could lead to different kind of action or leverage them in different ways. So one is that they can strengthen understanding of an issue or context to support campaign and organizing strategy. So this could look like power mapping or network mapping. So in our work, this might be who needs to be pressured or swayed in order to create a bond supporting public fund for community land trust. Or this kind of question might be about an assessment of a current context. So just the how question: how many homeowners in South Richmond are at risk of losing their homes, soon? So this is one type of question there. We can go to the next slide, Dwayne. And Tamisha, feel free to jump in on any of these, of course. Another question is around expanding the analysis or understanding of an issue. I think these are some of those questions you were speaking to, Tamisha, in terms of the why questions, right? So why did my grandma lose her home during the foreclosure crisis? How did our family losing our home impact our relationships to each other? Right. So thinking of those as both internal questions, relational within close relationships, and one looking at systems as well. So we can go to the next one, Dwayne. Another is about connecting the personal to the structural. So this is kind of a second layer of that last question. But what larger forces caused my grandma's house to go into foreclosure? How widespread is it in our community? And what are the structures or histories that are responsible for this trend? Right. And so thinking about one of the ways that I think this is a really great way to one of the ways to do this is a lot of times is timelining. Asking, thinking about the where we were at different points and how we connect those points and experiences at different times. Cool. We can go to the next one as well. Questions can also center the analysis of people most impacted by an issue. Right. This is at the core of PAR. Why are my friends and family leaving Richmond? So not necessarily going to the housing expert at UC Berkeley to answer your question, but going back to people in the community that are connected to this to ask that question. Or how can we better help each other stay in our homes, right? Knowing that, there are tools and strategies existing that are already being practiced, and how do we strengthen those as they are. Great. Go to another one.
A couple of the questions we asked ourselves were, how long have people been leaving Richmond?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Even before the foreclosure crisis, I think like that question came up in our process around, well, how long have people been leaving Richmond? And then the who, like who is impacted and who has been leaving and who is coming as a result of those who can no longer be, who are no longer here, can no longer be here.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And those, and all these categories really overlap too, right? So those questions are also around building, like this is like building knowledge base of your members or general public, so that we are better set up to engage in our strategies. So I think one we've been working on around is like, what reservations do you have around a community land trust? There's a lot of like pushback around what does it mean to have community held wealth versus privately held wealth, and why is that important? Or what is what is your understanding of a community land trust, and to even at base. And then I think this is the last one, or actually not the last one, but the next one, Dwayne. There's a lot of ones on this one, so we're gonna. This is really that strategic question of how do we make a case to key decision makers, and so I'm going to just share that this takes the place of sometimes this is about data, right? So how do we do surveys? So I'm thinking about some of that survey that you all did recently, Tamisha, around youth experiences, young folks' experiences, and creating data that didn't exist previously around some of those issues in reentry and young folks, and contact with police and thinking around that. Also stories, what are the stories that aren't being told? What are the dominant stories? How are they misaligned with what people are experiencing? And how can that be brought to bear with decision makers? It's also about strengthening or expanding existing coalitions. So I think one of the examples that you all did, Tamisha, was when you did a survey of small business owners to show support for some of the policies and work, from a sector that wasn't necessarily immediately aligned with, reentry and advocating for the rights of formerly incarcerated. Great, we'll go to the next one. And then, of course, potentially the most important one is just envisioning an alternative. What are the things that we already have that can be strengthened? What would we like to see? How do we push back against the dominant frame around the idea of like what questions need to get asked that reinforce systems and structures as they are? So, Dwayne, if we could go to the next slide, and we're gonna invite folks just in the next couple minutes. And again, we'll have some time. You can come back to this, but the questions we would pose in that worksheet would just be to choose one of these questions from the above list and develop a question or two related to that issue. So really this is about practicing, like challenging yourself to be like, okay, so what's a question that I would ask to envision an alternative? What's a question that I would ask to build the base of people that I work with? What's a question that I would ask to pressure a decision maker, and getting used to that, kind of those different forms of questions. And then thinking about how you would go about answering your questions. So different questions require or ask for different ways of answering them, ostensibly, but you can also answer, a data question in multiple different ways. And I think next week, Selena from Southwest Folklife Alliance is really going to get into that more as we get into documentation and thinking about, how we share stories and how we share information and think about collecting and cultivating knowledge. And then, this is also tied to that is what methods might you use? What information do you need and how could you gather it? So, we're going to, just because we have a few minutes left, I'm going to, Dwayne, if you could put up this next slide, we're going to share this as the kind of general type of questions that are left here. And we're going to invite you just to respond to those and practice writing a couple questions using any of these categories or types. And in the meantime, as you write those questions, or if you have questions for me or Tamisha or for Nicole, we'll invite you to put those in the chat and come on in. And Nicole, if you have anything, come on back in and we can talk a little bit more about any of this.
One question, but also a general question: will we have access to the slides? So maybe just
yes, so we can make these slides and these categories available. We will send a follow-up email as a thank you generally for everyone, and we'll include these slides in here. We'll also we can also drop this link into the worksheet for future use as well. And so if there are no other questions or thoughts, we'll leave you all with this prompt to just practice your questions, practice your question posing, and remembering that I think from the original definition or the original working definition from Highlander, that this is a collective process, and part of what we're doing in this workshop is really just about practice, and that any questions that we come up with in this space would need to be brought into dialogue with the folks that you work with, cut up, reformed, put back together in that kind of messy process that artists and participatory action researchers get into. So in that, just really want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank Jen and Shayla from Antenna for joining us and interpreting on the Spanish channel. Big thanks to Billy Sanders for your work in interpretation ASL. Huge thank you, Nicole, for fielding the questions, and everyone who joined us today. And just, so much gratitude to Tamisha for the work that you do in this hour and a half that we've been together, but also just more generally that you've done for a long time, and just, for everything that you will continue to do. And really just, next week, next Tuesday, we have a different time that will be with Southwest Folklife Alliance with Selena Morales. And we'll get into some more great stuff around documentation. But Tamisha, I just wanted to see, or Nicole, if you all had any other thoughts or, anything before we close on out.
The only thing that I'm thinking right now, as we're also thinking about what does a more just world look like? How do we move on from here? We are in a very real, biological crisis, environmental crisis, social justice crisis. And it is so important to take care of yourself and your people while we make these great attempts to build our collective capacity and seek justice. And that it is okay to slow down, to stop, and to start over.
Yeah, with that, thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us and taking the time. We truly appreciate it, and we hope to see you next Tuesday evening, same time. Until then, see you all later.
Thank you.